Hi there. Tonight, we're quietly drifting into American Primeval, a strange little corner of United States history where a war began, not with muskets or marching boots, but with memos. It's the story of how a dusty office in Washington, District of Columbia, a few confused letters, and a whole lot of silence sparked a military expedition across the plains. They called it the Mormon War, or the Utah Expedition, or Buchanan's Blunder. No famous battles, no heroes in shining armor, just paperwork, pride, and a long, slow misunderstanding. If this kind of peaceful storytelling helps you rest, you're welcome to subscribe. No pressure at all. It just helps us keep making quiet things for quiet nights. Now, breathe easy, close your eyes, and come with me to the heavy spring air of the year 1857. In Washington, the late spring sun stretched its light across the marble steps and dusty brick lanes. The air was warm, almost heavy. Inside the federal buildings, windows stood open to invite a breeze that never came. Curtains hung still. Paperweights held down reports that curled from the damp. Ink smudged slowly across official letters. Pens scratched quietly in corners. A fly buzzed lazily near the ceiling, tapping against the glass with no sense of urgency. Here, in the nation's capital, the world was not at war, not in the usual sense. There were no battles being fought within its borders, no drums, no marching orders shouted aloud. And yet, war had already begun, not by cannon, not by clash, but by confusion. James Buchanan had just taken office, the 15th president, a Pennsylvanian bachelor with white hair, a sharp mind, and a deep sense of caution. His first months in office were spent navigating a nation already splitting at the seams. Slavery debates boiled in Congress. Kansas teetered between law and chaos. And yet, his eyes turned west, to Utah, a distant territory, vast, remote, populated by mountains, desert, and a people who call themselves saints, the Mormons. Led by Brigham Young, the Mormon community had trekked west a decade earlier after suffering violence and expulsion from the east. They had built a new city from dust and salt, nestled at the foot of towering peaks, Salt Lake City. Brigham Young was not just their religious leader, he was also their territorial governor, their judge, their administrator, their guide. He signed the paperwork and spoke from the pulpit. His influence stretched from farm to frontier. To outsiders, it seemed too much. Rumors trickled eastward. Reports, written in formal tones, spoke of rebellion, disobedience, theocratic rule. Federal appointees had left the territory complaining of obstruction, disrespect, and isolation. Some wrote that they feared for their lives. Were the Mormons planning to break away? Were they loyal to the Union? Did they still recognize federal authority? No one knew for certain, but the reports made their way into the inboxes of politicians. The language was vague, the tone alarmed. Letters written by men who had spent little time in the territory, misunderstood its customs, or disliked its isolation. Letters that made small problems seem large. That turned confusion into conspiracy. And so President Buchanan decided to act. With no formal investigation, no emissary sent ahead, no dialogue attempted, he would send an army, 2,500 soldiers, a new territorial governor, and a message, obedience. But this decision, like the memos that inspired it, would move slowly. Orders were issued, contracts drawn, supplies packed, and all of it moved at the pace of mid-19th century logistics. Weeks passed, and in Utah, the Mormons heard nothing. No notice, no letter, no warning. They simply woke one morning to the distant sound of hooves and wagons. The army was coming, and so A misunderstanding became a standoff. The Saints believed they were under threat. Another persecution. Another forced removal. They remembered Missouri, Illinois, the assassinations, the burnings. They prepared. Brigham Young declared martial law. The Nauvoo Legion, their militia, was activated. Roads were blocked, supply lines disrupted, mountains watched. The army, confused by delays, found themselves stalled before winter. Snow trapped them, supplies dwindled, tempers rose. No battles were fought, not in this first phase. But the tension was thick enough to cut with a dull knife. Back in Washington, the consequences of Buchanan's decision had yet to unfold. The paperwork sat in neat stacks. A war born of paper, frozen in snow, fed by silence. And all because no one sent a letter. The camp was named Scott, but no one remembered who Scott was. It sat in the bleak chill of southwestern Wyoming, not far from the ruins of Fort Bridger. Snow gathered at its edges like a sleeping dog, stubborn and unmoving. The wind curled through the tents, picking at the canvas and muttering secrets no one wanted to hear. By early winter of the year 1857, the United States Army was encamped and idle. The march had ended not with arrival, but with surrender to the elements. Horses starved, wagons cracked. Boots wore thin. It was not a battle, not even a standoff, just a long, slow wait. Inside the camp, time stretched thin. Days passed in quiet monotony. Fires were lit and fed. Beans boiled, ice cracked in buckets. The same stories were told in different words. Men sharpened bayonets that would never be used. Drills were shortened, logs split, letters written with cold hands. The Mormons, somewhere beyond the snowed-over passes, were unseen but not forgotten. Scouts had reported small groups on ridges. Fires glimpsed in the distance, but no attacks, no charges. The Saints waited too, behind their own lines, behind their own logic. President Buchanan's appointed governor, Alfred Cumming, was still hundreds of miles behind the column. He waited with the remainder of the reinforcements, unsure if he would be welcomed with open doors or drawn weapons. He wrote letters of his own, calm, moderate letters, but they moved slower than the wind. Brigham Young, back in Salt Lake City, issued sermons that were half scripture and half strategy. He reminded his followers of Missouri, of Illinois, of martyrdom and exile. He told them to build up their food stores, to warm their homes, to be ready. He did not say whether he would yield. Inside Camp Scott, Colonel Johnston finally arrived. His bearing was strong, tall, measured. The soldiers respected him, but even he could not unfreeze the snow. He looked west and saw a problem that could not be solved with rifles. A war with no war, an enemy who did not attack, an army that did not advance. The days shortened, the cold deepened, the woodpile shrank. Morale was neither high nor low, it simply was, numb, wrapped in blankets, focused on survival. Letters from Washington were rare, news slower still. The only certainty was that nothing was certain. They had been sent to solve a problem no one could explain. And so they waited. They ate hardtack and chewed it slowly. They melted snow and drank it cautiously. They watched the horizon for shapes that never moved. Camp Scott remained, unchanging, unmoved. Far behind the frozen stillness of Camp Scott, across plains lined with hoof prints and wagon ruts, another figure waited to begin his strange chapter in the American West. Alfred Cumming, a man caught between the paper orders of the East and the brittle expectations of the West. Appointed governor of Utah Territory by President Buchanan in the fall of the year 1857, Cumming had left his post in Georgia with a curious mix of pride and apprehension. He had accepted the office with honor, but the details were scarce. There had been no proper briefing, no clear plan for transfer of authority, and no promise of welcome. All he carried were letters of appointment, official seals, and a growing sense of unease. He was, after all, replacing Brigham Young, not just a territorial governor, but a prophet in the eyes of tens of thousands, a spiritual figurehead, a patriarch. To arrive with a piece of paper and a few military escorts would be, at best, awkward, at worst, a provocation. Cumming's party made slow progress west. The roads grew rougher with each mile. Cold winds swept down from the Rocky Mountains, curling around their wagons and snapping at the horses. The men wore thick coats, wrapped their faces in scarves, and spoke less as the days shortened. Each night, Cumming sat by the fire and reviewed his letters. He had been instructed to assume peaceful control, but no instructions followed on how to do so. How does one peacefully displace a theocratic leader in a land far removed from Washington's reach? At distant intervals, riders came bearing news. The army was snowbound near Fort Bridger. The Saints had not attacked. Supplies were dwindling. Congress remained largely indifferent. And so Cumming waited. He camped with soldiers and scouts. He met with couriers. He read from his journal and sometimes aloud from the Bible. He practiced patience. He wondered. Would the Saints resist him? Would Brigham Young step aside? Would there be blood? As the new year dawned, the year 1858, whispers began to reach Salt Lake City. Whispers that a civilian governor, not an army general, was coming. That he came not with fire, but with parchment. That he did not wish to rule, but to serve. Brigham Young considered these whispers. He spoke with his counselors. He read the signs. And quietly, he chose a path that surprised many. He would receive the governor, but not before staging one final, quiet resistance, not of force, but of absence. By the time Alfred Cumming began the final stretch toward the Salt Lake Valley, the city had begun a slow, deliberate evacuation. Entire families packed wagons. They moved south, toward Provo and beyond. Furniture left behind, fields unattended, houses swept clean and shuttered. When Cumming arrived, Salt Lake City was nearly empty. Its streets were silent, its shops closed. He walked through the heart of the settlement and heard only the wind in the cottonwoods. Still, he was not deterred. He requested a meeting with Brigham Young, and Young, settled now in Provo, agreed. The two men met in early spring. Their conversation was quiet, cordial, respectful. Young made no attempt to mask his skepticism. Cumming made no demand for allegiance. They spoke of governance, of the Constitution, of prophecy, of snow and distance and duty. And, slowly, through small steps and soft tones, something strange happened. A peaceful transfer began. The Saints began to return home. Wagons rumbled back up the dusty roads. Windows were unshuttered. Water boiled again in iron kettles. Life resumed. And Alfred Cumming, quiet, cautious, deliberate, became governor of Utah. No battles. No arrests. Just two men sitting across a table, choosing words over war. As the spring thaw swept over the mountains of the Utah Territory, it touched the peaks first, slowly dripping into creeks and streams, seeping downward into the valleys below. Snow retreated, inch by inch. Roads reappeared, mud-slick and uneven. The army stirred once more. Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston, finally rejoined with his full command, made preparations to resume the march toward Salt Lake City. His officers, weary from a winter of wind and waiting, began inspecting wagons, tightening saddles, and rechecking crates of spoiled flour and cracked powder kegs. The Utah expedition, which had once been a rush to restore order, had become a long, expensive drift. Yet, even as the ice melted, tension remained frozen in the narrow space between army and settlement. It lived now in the canyons, in the crags and shadows of Echo Canyon, where red stone walls stood like gates and the road wound thin as thread. Echo Canyon was the great natural bottleneck leading into the Salt Lake Valley, a long stretch of defensible terrain where a few hundred men could delay thousands. Brigham Young and his militia had prepared it the year before, stacking boulders, digging trenches, and lining ridge lines with the signs of readiness. Their work remained. When Johnston's scouts entered the canyon in early summer of the year 1858, they found the defenses abandoned but intact. Earthworks, brush piled for burning, and stone barricades. The Saints had cleared out, but they had not cleaned up. The message was clear: we could have resisted. And in Washington, that message was being read in different ways. Some newspapers praised the Mormons for their restraint. Others accused them of subversion. Political cartoons mocked the president's indecision. The term Buchanan's blunder began to circulate more openly, whispered in drawing rooms and printed beneath headlines. In Salt Lake City, the people resumed their daily rhythms. Blacksmiths hammered iron into shoes. Farmers turned earth and planted seeds. School children recited their lessons. Yet always eyes turned east, watching for dust clouds, listening for hoofbeats. Governor Cumming took up office quietly. He held meetings in a modest building not far from the tabernacle. He made no sweeping proclamations. He wrote letters home, describing a city both strange and familiar, where religion shaped life more visibly than law. He began to earn a cautious respect. Brigham Young stepped aside publicly, though his influence remained. He did not disappear, nor did he argue. He spoke in Sunday sermons and walked among the people, more prophet than politician. His tone, though, had softened. Less fire, more patience. Johnston, for his part, did not march his army into the city. Instead, on Cumming's counsel, he established a new post several miles to the south, Camp Floyd. It was named not for Utah, not for peace, but for John B. Floyd, the Secretary of War back in Washington, a man whose legacy, like so many, would soon be eclipsed by larger storms to come. Camp Floyd quickly grew. Tents gave way to barracks. Officers dined in modest halls. Horses grazed on open range. Soldiers drilled under the high sun, but without purpose. There was nothing to fight. No territory to secure. Only presence to maintain. Supplies flowed in. More than 10,000 civilians followed. Teamsters, merchants, entertainers. A small economy sprouted around the camp. For a time, Camp Floyd was the third largest city in the territory. And still, no shot was fired. Echo Canyon faded from the headlines. Its walls held silence now, echoes of what never came. A war that did not arrive. A canyon that did not burn. A march that ended in dust and boredom. Camp Floyd was not meant to be a city. It began as a temporary encampment, a buffer between Brigham Young's Salt Lake and the slowly deflating pride of the federal government. But like all things left to grow, it expanded. From scattered tents into orderly rows, from canvas shelters into timber barracks, from a name on a map into a place with noise and habit and dust that stuck to boots. By the end of summer in the year 1858, Camp Floyd housed over 3,000 soldiers and more than 10,000 civilians. It sat like an island in the valley, separated from Salt Lake not just by miles, but by purpose. The saints rarely visited, the soldiers rarely ventured far. The space between them was filled with dust, silence, and occasional rumors. Merchants followed the army west. Saloons were built from freight crates. Blacksmiths worked around the clock, hammering out nails, hinges, and horseshoes. Tailors, gamblers, and cooks set up shop beside laundresses and newspaper men. The town sprang up almost by accident, sustained not by vision but by inertia. And what did the soldiers do? They drilled. They stood guard. They patrolled paths where nothing ever happened. They filled out reports with nothing to report. They wrote home about the heat, the flies, the dryness. They polished boots and then muddied them again. They waited. Every morning began with reveille. Every evening ended with taps. In between, the hours dragged. The officers organized inspections, then reorganized them. They debated formations, argued over supply routes, made lists and copies of lists. And still, there was no war. In Salt Lake City, the saints continued to live their separate lives. The city rebuilt what had been evacuated. Children returned to school. Sermons resumed with their usual rhythm. Brigham Young walked quietly among the people, his power no longer official but no less real. He watched Camp Floyd from afar, understanding its presence as both threat and theater. Governor Alfred Cummings sent reports to Washington. His letters were measured, calm, and largely ignored. The nation had turned its attention elsewhere. Kansas, the Supreme Court. The ever-growing shadows of slavery and secession. Camp Floyd became a footnote in real time. But for those living in it, the days were not short, they were long, stretched by sameness, weighted by waiting. The sutlers made money, the whiskey was watered, the dances were awkward. There were occasional scuffles, but no uprisings. A few desertions, a few duels, but mostly there was routine. And dust. So much dust. It clung to the tents, to the uniforms, to the lungs. It coated the beans. It dulled the shine of brass buttons. When it rained, the dust turned to mud. When it dried, the mud cracked and returned to dust again. The irony of Camp Floyd's name grew clearer. John B. Floyd, the Secretary of War who had helped send them west, would later resign in disgrace, accused of corruption, branded a traitor. He fled south as the nation fractured. But his name remained, a marker of decisions made in distant offices, played out on distant plains. And Camp Floyd, once the symbol of control, became a monument to delay. Out on the plains where the sky is wide and the sun stretches long shadows over grass that rustles like whispers, a new kind of traveler appeared. Not soldiers, not saints, but riders. They came in leather and dust, riding lean horses across the emptiest parts of the American West. Riders who did not settle, who did not stay. They came for the mail. By the spring of the year 1859, the Utah War was little more than a memory. Camp Floyd had become a dusty routine. Governor Cummings penned few words. Brigham Young kept sermons focused on scripture, not soldiers. and the federal government, now distracted by a deepening national divide, stopped sending strong opinions. The silence left space for something else to grow. Communication. It began quietly, a few mail contracts, a few eager entrepreneurs. But soon the dusty trails that crossed Utah and the surrounding territories became something more, veins of information connecting the East to the Pacific. The Overland Mail Company, guided by John Butterfield and his vision of speed and determination, carved a route through the American silence. Long wooden coaches drawn by teams of 6 horses bounced across sagebrush and sandstone. The path was long, nearly 3,000 miles, and it took 25 days, give or take a blizzard. In dusty stations spaced every 20 miles or so, hostlers waited with fresh horses. Tiny outposts made of logs or adobe, often staffed by only 1 or 2 men. They kept the fire burning, the water drawn, and the saddles dry. They waited for the sound of hooves. Mailbags bulged with letters. Some were official government correspondence. Some were newspapers folded tightly. Some were personal letters, written by candlelight back east and destined for a lonely miner in California. Few were read by the men who carried them, but all were guarded like treasure. The journey was not glamorous, it was not safe. Dust storms, flash floods, occasional arrows from unseen hills. Sometimes the riders carried revolvers. More often, they carried little but the mail and a pocket Bible. Utah's open spaces became not just a symbol of distance but a thoroughfare, and with each passing coach, the world grew slightly smaller. And then came the Pony Express. It sounded like a fantasy, a relay of young men riding Mustangs at breakneck speed, changing horses every 10 miles, galloping day and night across 2,000 miles of wild country. But it was real. From St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, the Pony Express riders covered the continent in just 10 days. A miracle, it was said. Expensive, unsustainable, and short-lived. But a miracle nonetheless. And it passed through Utah. Salt Lake City became one of its key stations. Riders dashed in and out, switching horses, gulping water, and racing west again before the dust even settled. It was not war that defined this chapter, not settlers or prophets, not soldiers or presidents. It was letters. Letters that told of weddings and deaths. Letters that offered business deals and courtships. Letters that soothed mothers and worried fathers. Letters that connected. The dry air carried more than dust now. It carried news. But still, the misunderstandings persisted. Rumors flew faster than riders. Some said the Saints were planning rebellion again. Some accused Johnston's troops of plotting arrest. Newspapers often exaggerated. Even peaceful days were twisted into something darker by the time the story reached New York. And so, the mail did not always bring clarity. But it brought connection. And connection, however imperfect, laid the foundation for what would come. Camp Floyd remained, now quieter. Soldiers re-enlisted or returned east. The civilian economy around the camp began to shrink as the novelty faded. Merchants moved on, some to California. Some to mining towns, some to ruin. The Saints looked west, beyond the valley, toward new lands. And the riders kept riding. Dust followed them, and behind the dust, stories. Out beyond Camp Floyd, where the sagebrush grows thick and dry, the Army once built more than tents and barracks. It built watchfulness. It laid timbers not just for shelter, but for presence. Markers of a federal gaze, outposts of supposed order in a land too wide to hold. These were the forts, not fortresses of stone with grand towers and echoing chambers. but wooden stockades, log buildings, dust-covered squares with creaking gates. Places like Fort Bridger, Fort Laramie, Fort Supply, and the briefly bustling, now fading Camp Floyd. By the early autumn of the year 1859, many of these posts had begun to change. Their original purpose, whether to manage tribes, to resupply pioneers, or to stand ready against Mormon resistance, had shifted. Now they became islands of monotony. The war that never happened left behind the shell of a force that no longer knew what to expect. The soldiers swept the same dirt each morning, guarded the same gates no one tried to enter. They stood atop wooden platforms, watching sunsets and dust devils. They counted wagons that passed without stopping. The tension of earlier months, once tight as a drawn bowstring, loosened into routine. The locals, settlers, traders, saints, adapted too. They grew used to the uniforms, the glint of buttons, the smell of leather and smoke. A few bartered, a few married, most simply ignored. Letters came less often. Reports to Washington were thinner. Interest in Utah's occupation had faded from the public eye, replaced by louder headlines. Slave states, abolition, Dred Scott, Lincoln's speeches. The East turned inward while the West yawned and stretched. Brigham Young no longer protested. He had returned to the role he knew best, patriarch of a people, steward of a faith. He planned new settlements deeper into the frontier. He spoke of irrigation, self-sufficiency, and endurance. Governor Cumming, still in office, became something like a ghost of the government, present but quiet. He held meetings that drew few attendees. He issued proclamations few read. He walked Salt Lake streets alone, hands behind his back, humming sometimes. And Camp Floyd watched itself fade. Its population shrank. Civilians packed wagons, saloons closed, traders moved on. The army itself began to trickle eastward, drawn by whispers of southern militancy and the slow division of the nation. The buildings stood, but the footsteps grew fewer. In this time of slow withdrawal, new forts were planned, then delayed. The government's attention had shifted. Military planners debated whether to invest in stronger western outposts or focus nearer the Mississippi. Supply lines shortened, budgets tightened, ambitions shrank. Out in the dry valleys, wooden gates hung crooked. Canvas roofs flapped loose. Chickens scratched where cannons once stood. Dogs roamed freely. The memory of conflict never born left a strange kind of imprint. Not a scar, but a shadow. Not a tragedy, but a silence. Echoes of effort without climax. In the years to come, the Civil War would tear at the very center of the country. But here, in Utah Territory, it was still the lull before the storm. The moment when nothing happens and everything's about to, and in that moment the forts waited. The guards turned their heads. The hills rolled on. The land, once measured in days of travel and weeks of silence, began to shrink. Not in size, but in distance. Not in distance, but in delay. For centuries, messages crossed the plains in the saddlebag of a lone rider, or in the hands of a weary stagecoach driver covered in dust and sweat. But now, in the dawn of the year 1860, men began to string wire between wooden poles. They carried it across rivers and deserts, around mountain slopes, and through sagebrush flats. They drilled holes in frozen ground. They stood on ladders while storms gathered above, and slowly, pole by pole, the telegraph came. It was not a dramatic arrival. There were no parades, no headlines, just the steady clink of hammers, the scrape of augers, the quiet tying of wire in empty places. And with each new mile completed, the future came a little closer. The transcontinental telegraph, they called it. And it changed everything. Messages that once took weeks could now be sent in minutes. Washington, District of Columbia, could speak to San Francisco in a handful of seconds. Presidents could send orders. Generals could ask questions. Businessmen could send prices. Mothers could send news. The West did not change overnight, but it began to hum with a new kind of presence. A presence made not of soldiers or settlers, but of signals. Camp Floyd, like the others, noticed. Slowly, subtly, the telegraph line passed close, and eventually it connected. Officers received instructions faster than ever before. Orders changed with confusing speed. Supplies were diverted, some regiments were reassigned. The long hours of boredom that once defined Army life were still there, but now they were occasionally interrupted by a slip of paper, a sudden update, a new instruction, a change of plan. The stillness began to flicker, and out in Salt Lake City the saints watched with quiet curiosity. Some feared it, others embraced it. Brigham Young, ever strategic, recognized the power of connection. He lobbied for lines to extend to church settlements. He sent riders to welcome the workers. He provided laborers and offered supplies. He saw, perhaps more than most, that to survive in the American future, one must first be connected to it. In October of the year 1861, the first complete message was sent across the continent, from California to the capital, uninterrupted. The Pony Express shut down within days. That daring experiment, those brave riders and fast horses, had no place in the world of humming wires and clacking keys. They disappeared almost instantly. Most of their stations closed. Their saddles were sold. Their stories became legend. The forts, too, felt the shift. They were no longer relay points. They became relay stations, places where signals passed through, but not where people stayed. Time itself began to bend. What once took weeks now took hours. Perception changed. The country seemed smaller, the urgency greater. The patience that once defined the Western rhythm began to dissolve. Soldiers wrote fewer letters. They received news more frequently. The conversations became shorter, quicker, more immediate. And so, the great silence of the West, that long pause between question and answer, was broken. Not loudly, not with celebration, but with a click. Click, click, click. The sound of wire against wire. The rhythm of telegraph keys tapping out meaning into the ether. A song of metal and current. And beneath it all, the dust still blew, the sage still stirred, the cattle still grazed, the wind still whispered through canyons. But above the land, over the land, through the land, the wires sang. Long after the armies marched away, and long after the wires were strung tight across the plains, the land still held memories. Not loud ones, not sung in the streets or printed in pamphlets, but soft ones, pressed into soil, etched into the rocks, left behind in the bones of the trails. Wagon ruts. They stretched still across parts of the American West. Shallow depressions, twin lines worn into earth by wooden wheels and iron-rimmed hubs. They do not speak, but they remember. Every creek, every turn, every slow descent down a slope remembered in grooves carved by repetition. By the early years of the 1860s, the West had become a corridor, not a destination, but a passage. Settlers from the East no longer came to see the desert. They came to pass through it. California called. Oregon beckoned, and the trails through Utah became arteries of movement. Some followed the Oregon Trail. Some took the Mormon Trail. Some braved the Hastings Cutoff. still haunted by tales of frozen wagons and desperate choices. All of them left tracks, and so the land bore them. Salt Lake City sat quietly at the center of this motion, not always welcoming, not always resisting, just enduring. The Saints, ever industrious, built new routes. They constructed ferries across muddy rivers. They patched old roads with gravel and timber. They extended hospitality when it suited them, and barriers when it did not. Their settlements dotted the valleys and hillsides, not with the grandeur of cities, but with the regularity of planning. Grids, gardens, granaries, and always the trails passed by. The federal government noticed this increasing movement. Surveyors were sent. Maps were drawn. Treaties, sometimes honored, were signed with native nations. New forts were proposed, some never built. The West was being named, claimed, measured. But beneath all that movement, the laws, the lines, the declarations, the wagons still creaked, and the soil still remembered. Bones were left too, of animals, of settlers, of dreams. Some wagons broke wheels and were abandoned. Some children grew sick and were buried under mounds of stone and sage. Some travelers turned back. Some pushed forward. Some were never seen again. The land, though, kept no ledger. It simply absorbed the evidence. A rusting nail here, a broken hoop there, a name carved into soft sandstone, dates worn thin by wind. And over time, as the trains came, with their shrieking whistles and endless rails, the wagon trails began to fade. The ruts grew shallow. The wheels stopped turning. The bones, both wooden and human, fell silent. But for those who still wandered on foot or on horseback, or who took detours from the railroad, the memory remained. You could follow a line of sage and suddenly see them, twin tracks dipping through a dry creek bed. You could walk beside them and imagine the shape of a family, the mother walking, the father guiding oxen, the children sleeping in the wagon's shadow. The silence held it all. Even now, the wind does not erase everything. It smooths, but it does not forget. It buries, but it does not destroy. Wagon ruts still speak to the slowness of a different time. They are not dramatic. They are not celebrated. They are just there, faint lines in a great canvas. The bones beneath the West. It began, as many things in the American West began, not with thunder, but with planning. Not with celebration, but with surveyors. The year was early in the 6th decade of the 19th century. The vast stretches of land between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean remained broad and open. Much of it was still unmapped, or poorly mapped, or argued about on parchment in Washington, but there was one idea, one whisper, growing louder, a line. A line of iron, drawn across the heart of the continent, a railroad. For years, the idea of connecting the coasts had floated in political halls and smoky saloons. People dreamed of cutting weeks from journeys, of taming the wilderness with steam. And by 1862, amidst the throes of the American Civil War, Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act. Even as the nation split, it built. The Union Pacific would begin in the east, pushing westward. The Central Pacific would begin in the west, pushing eastward. Somewhere they would meet. No one yet knew exactly where. But in between those starting points lay the deserts, mountains, and silent valleys of Utah. Salt Lake City stirred. Brigham Young, always attuned to the currents of power, recognized the moment. The Saints had carved a home in the desert, but the iron rails would bring more than goods, they would bring strangers. Ideas. Government reach. Opportunity. Threats. Still, he offered support. Materials. Labor. water, timber, because to resist change completely was to invite isolation. The work began slowly. From Omaha, graders moved west with shovels and hope. From Sacramento, they cut through the granite of the Sierra Nevada with powder and sweat. Chinese laborers by the thousands blasted and chiseled. Irishmen swung picks and laid ties. Progress came in bursts. Miles gained 1 month, lost the next. By 1866, the Union Pacific crews had reached the high plains of Wyoming. The line was moving steadily toward Utah territory. And in those same months, whispers of the coming railroad rolled ahead of it like storm clouds across a prairie. The Saints watched the horizon. They saw telegraph crews preparing the way, stringing lines alongside paths once walked by pioneers. They saw surveyors taking measurements, marking future station sites, arguing quietly in the dirt over curves and grades. Some families welcomed them, offering bread and rest. Others turned away, uncertain. As the rails grew longer, so too did the conversations in Salt Lake. Would the train pass to the north, near Ogden? Would it slice closer, through the city itself? Would it bypass them entirely? Every rumor carried consequence. Land was purchased. Streets were widened. Shops expanded. Meanwhile, the crews pressed on. From the east, the Union Pacific overcame snowstorms, buffalo herds, and sabotage. From the west, the Central Pacific endured avalanches and granite. And then, at last, in the spring of 1869, the ends drew near. Promontory Sumida, quiet patch of earth north of the Great Salt Lake, was chosen. There was no town, no station, just a meeting point. The last rails were laid by crews working double shifts. Locomotives from each company steamed toward the place. And on a clear morning in May, dignitaries gathered. The golden spike was tapped in. The rails were complete. The continent was bound. And then, the world kept turning. The Saints exhaled. The railroad had not cut through their city, but it had passed close enough. Ogden grew overnight. Freight yards and roundhouses sprang up. Salt Lake adapted, shifting commerce toward the tracks. Stagecoaches grew fewer. Wagon trains dwindled. The old trails gathered dust. Yet, even with the iron presence, much remained the same. The wind still sighed through canyons. The herd still moved across sage flats. And out past the edges of the new stations, the silence held. For the train passed through, but it did not stay. It was motion without memory, a roar and a hiss, then a fading echo. And in that echo, people slept again. The soldiers at old Camp Floyd, now long redeployed or mustered out, might not have imagined such a future, nor the Saints who carved irrigation ditches 2 decades earlier, nor the tribes who had lived in the canyons for centuries. The rails came not with understanding but with movement. The creak of wagons gave way to the rhythm of wheels on rails. The long letters gave way to telegraph clicks. The months of travel gave way to days. The West was not smaller, but it felt closer. Still, beneath the tracks, the earth remembered the silence. The golden spike had been tapped, and the trains had come. But for the people of Utah, and for the land itself, it was not an end. It was not even truly a beginning. It was merely another season in the long, slow becoming of a place. The year was 1870, a new decade. The war between North and South had ended, but the scars still ran deep. In Washington, Reconstruction policies dominated debate. Across the country, former soldiers sought new lives, and many of them looked west. The railroad made that easier. In Utah, the Saints remained. Brigham Young, older now, with a beard streaked in gray, still guided his people. He gave sermons in the tabernacle. He reviewed plans for canals and meeting houses. He answered letters from settlements hundreds of miles apart. He sat in the late afternoons on porches shaded by vines, watching the streets of Salt Lake fill with more strangers than ever before. Not all who arrived came to join the church. Some were merchants, some were miners, some were simply restless. The town changed subtly. Boardwalks expanded, inns opened, telegraph offices clicked day and night. Yet, beneath the noise, the rhythm of the saints continued measured, intentional, quiet. Outside the city, new communities took root. Names like Provo, Lehi, and Nephi marked out the valleys. Log cabins gave way to adobe homes, which gave way to brick. Families planted orchards. Children memorized hymns and read scripture under candlelight. In those years, much of the American West was in motion. Boomtowns erupted in Nevada. Cattle drives thundered across Texas. Native nations were pushed further from their lands, but Utah remained steady. And it was this steadiness that caught the government's attention again. Polygamy. Long whispered about, long criticized, now became the centerpiece of a national campaign. In Congress, speeches were made, editorials were written. The question was simple: could a territory that openly practiced plural marriage remain outside federal norms? The answer, for many, was no. Federal marshals arrived in greater numbers. Judges were appointed from outside the territory. Warrants were issued, arrests were made, yet resistance was rarely violent. It came instead in the form of silence, disappearances, refusals to testify. Communities closed ranks. Brigham Young gave no ground, but he watched carefully. And still, the trains rolled by. Each day, more people arrived in Utah. Not just saints, but investors, wanderers, curious eyes. Each brought a little piece of elsewhere. Newspapers from New York, fabric from Boston, seeds from Illinois, ideas. Some stayed, others passed through. And always, the land remained. The Great Salt Lake shimmered. Its waters receded slightly, then rose again. The Wasatch Mountains loomed over every roofline. Snow melted into streams. The sun scorched the canyons in summer and softened them in autumn. In this setting, history became slow. No great battles, no collapsing governments, no sudden shifts, only policy and law and slow erosion. One rule changed. One leader passed. One homestead abandoned, and another built. Families passed heirlooms from hand to hand. Fences were mended year after year. Footpaths became roads. And so Utah became not just a territory, but a mood, a rhythm, a quiet contradiction. It belonged to the saints, but not entirely. It stood apart, but remained tethered. It was watched. It was judged. It endured. Sleep now. Let the stillness of a slow decade settle into your breath. Let the footsteps of unseen settlers fade across your thought. Let the rustle of prairie grass soften the edge of every question. There is no verdict tonight, only patience, only process, only the long, slow becoming of a place. The railroad brought goods. The telegraph brought words. But it was the law that brought change slowly, silently, and almost always in the form of paper. By the middle of the 1870s, the federal government's attention had narrowed further onto Utah, not just the church, but the very structure of the territory. Could a place so distinct remain so autonomous? Could the saints shape a land where federal judges could barely enforce rulings? And so, a new wave of federal presence arrived, not soldiers, this time, but marshals. Men in black coats stepped down from trains and unpacked ledgers and warrants. Courtrooms were reassembled in dusty halls. Wooden benches were placed with careful reverence, and small flags were tacked above judges' heads. Law books stacked quietly in corners. Typewriters were unpacked. In Salt Lake City, the courthouse never echoed with outrage. Only with the slow shuffle of feet, the clearing of throats, the occasional creak of a pew. Polygamy, long defended by the saints as a divine commandment, had become the focal point of legal scrutiny. Testimonies were taken. Witnesses summoned. Cases built like towers of paper. Wives were asked to name their husbands. Children were asked who lived in their homes. Men refused to answer. Some were fined, others imprisoned, but most simply returned home knowing that time would pass, as it always did. Brigham Young, frailer with each passing year, continued to meet quietly with church leaders. He counseled caution but not retreat. His voice remained steady, even as his strength declined. Beyond the city, smaller communities watched from afar. In Lehigh, in Manti, in Parowan, people planted crops, tended fences, and sent grain to Salt Lake. Few saw the inside of a courtroom. Fewer still understood the shifting sands of federal law, but they heard the stories brothers summoned, neighbors missing, homes questioned. The presence of the law, like the telegraph before it, was invisible but deeply felt. Judges rotated through assignments, some lasting months, others years. Some tried to learn local customs, others enforced their own. Yet none could erase the stillness of the land. The Wasatch Peaks rose unchanged. The sky pressed close in autumn. Children still walked barefoot to church. The sound of a screen door closing still marked supper. The people lived with the pressure of law like they lived with snow, predictable, unwelcome, and always melting in the spring. And beyond the reach of the courthouse, the land rolled outward. To the north, where ranchers counted cattle in near silence. To the south, where red canyons held the sun until twilight. To the east, where fences ended and the wilderness breathed. The paper trail of court cases would stretch for decades, but few ever read them. They gathered dust. They whispered of decisions. They recorded names. But the people kept living. They mended roofs. They taught school. They held dances in barns. And in doing so, they resisted not with fire, but with quietness. The railroad brought goods, the telegraph brought words, but it was the law that brought change, slowly, silently, and almost always in the form of paper. By the middle of the 1870s, the federal government's attention had narrowed further onto Utah, not just the church, but the very structure of the territory. Could a place so distinct remain so autonomous? Could the saints shape a land where federal judges could barely enforce rulings? And so a new wave of federal presence arrived, not soldiers this time, but marshals. Men in black coats stepped down from trains and unpacked ledgers and warrants. Courtrooms were reassembled in dusty halls. Wooden benches were placed with careful reverence, and small flags were tacked above judges' heads. Law books stacked quietly in corners. Typewriters were unpacked. In Salt Lake City, the courthouse never echoed with outrage, only with the slow shuffle of feet, the clearing of throats, the occasional creak of a pew. Polygamy, long defended by the saints as a divine commandment, had become the focal point of legal scrutiny. Testimonies were taken. Witnesses summoned. Cases built like towers of paper. Wives were asked to name their husbands. Children were asked who lived in their homes. Men refused to answer. Some were fined, others imprisoned, but most simply returned home, knowing that time would pass, as it always did. Brigham Young, frailer with each passing year, continued to meet quietly with church leaders. He counseled caution but not retreat. His voice remained steady even as his strength declined. Beyond the city, smaller communities watched from afar. In Lehigh, in Monty, in Parowan, people planted crops, tended fences, and sent grain to Salt Lake. Few saw the inside of a courtroom. Fewer still understood the shifting sands of federal law, but they heard the stories brothers summoned, neighbors missing, homes questioned. The presence of the law, like the telegraph before it, was invisible but deeply felt. Judges rotated through assignments, some lasting months, others years. Some tried to learn local customs, others enforced their own. Yet none could erase the stillness of the land. The Wasatch Peaks rose unchanged. The sky pressed close in autumn. Children still walked barefoot to church. The sound of a screen door closing still marked supper. The people lived with the pressure of law like they lived with snow, predictable, unwelcome, and always melting in the spring. And beyond the reach of the courthouse, the land rolled outward. To the north, where ranchers counted cattle in near silence. To the south, where red canyons held the sun until twilight. To the east, where fences ended and the wilderness breathed. The paper trail of court cases would stretch for decades, but few ever read them. They gathered dust. They whispered of decisions. They recorded names, but the people kept living. They mended roofs. They taught school. They held dances in barns. And in doing so, they resisted not with fire, but with quietness. Sleep now. Let the gentle echo of a courthouse gavel settle in your chest. Let the testimonies dissolve into still air. Let the slow march of paper pass you by. There is no sentence tonight, only pauses, only parchment, only the long shadow of law falling over quiet places. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. Ashes in the Orchard. The passing of a prophet. The years turned slowly, and the seasons moved as they always had: cool mornings, warm noons, early frosts. Children grew taller, streets filled with newer wagons, and in the middle of Salt Lake City, a man aged. Brigham Young was not the same man who had led the exodus from Nauvoo. His walk had softened, his hair had grayed, his gaze, though still firm, now carried the heaviness of decades. And though he still spoke from the pulpit and chaired meetings with purpose, there was a hush beginning to form around him, a quiet reverence and a preparation. The summer of 1877 was hot. Bees buzzed slow in the garden rows. Fruit trees bore heavily. In the heat, conversation slowed. People fanned themselves on porches. And in the heart of the city, inside a shaded room lined with books and folded letters, Brigham Young fell ill. It was not sudden, but it was final. His family watched from the hallways. Leaders whispered outside closed doors. Messages were sent, but no announcements made. And then, on a still evening in late August, he passed. The news moved quietly. Church members gathered. Some wept. Others sat silently for hours. Children asked careful questions. There was no loud mourning, no dramatic procession, just a city pausing to acknowledge the loss of the man who had shaped its streets, its vision, its silence. In orchards outside the city, fruit fell to earth. In canyons, the wind blew soft through the rocks. And in quiet homes, candles burned a little longer. The funeral was held without spectacle. Eulogies spoke of deserts crossed, of cities founded, of faith kept through storms. But mostly, people remembered his steadiness, his ability to wait, to endure, to listen to stillness and find shape in it. With Brigham Young's passing, a new question settled over Utah. What now? For decades, he had been the pillar, the face, the planner. Without him, leaders would emerge, councils would convene, but none would carry his singular gravity. Not for some time. Outside observers wondered if Utah would fracture. It did not. It slowed. It paused. It watched. And in that pause, the land remained unchanged. Rivers still wound through the canyons. Children still played beneath peach trees. The train still hissed as it passed. But in quiet bedrooms, journals were opened. In lamplit rooms, new voices rehearsed speeches. And in the silence following the death of a prophet, the community listened. Night has arrived without asking. It slipped into the forest like a familiar ghost, one you forgot was always nearby. The sky, which earlier held the golden sun high above the tree line, is now a wash of deep blue ink, spilling into black around the edges. The stars haven't quite settled in yet, and the moon is somewhere behind the ridgeline, waiting. You're sitting beside what's left of the fire. The embers glow softly, quietly, not roaring or crackling, just pulsing with a dim orange breath, like the last heartbeats of a sleeping animal. The logs have been reduced to half-burned bones, and the smoke that rises from them is thin and slow, twisting lazily up into the treetops, where it vanishes like it was never there. Your blanket is wrapped around your shoulders, the rough wool scraped thin from many seasons of use. It smells like pine, ash, and a little of the damp earth beneath your feet. There is no tent tonight, just a lean-to of bent saplings and bark, propped up with stone and wishful thinking. It's not meant to keep the wild out. Nothing really can. But to give the illusion of a threshold between the world of humans and the world that pays no mind to them. And in that world, out beyond the firelight, something is moving. You hear it first as a shift, a pause in the wind, a break in the rhythm of leaves. The forest goes quiet in a particular way. Not silent, but cautious, like it's waiting for something to pass through. And in that pause, you hear it, a howl, not close, not far, a voice rising from the deep woods, long and unbroken, like a question held too long in the throat. It echoes along the valley floor, bouncing off stone and bark until it fades into the nothing. You don't react, not outwardly, because this isn't your first night among wolves, and it won't be the last. The wolves in this land are not monsters, not villains with glowing eyes. They are simply there, present, existing beside you, as they have done for centuries, long before maps, long before fences, long before you. Still, the sound of them, the raw music of their voices, stirs something in you. Not fear exactly, something older than that, a recognition, a distant thread of memory in your bones that remembers what it means to be hunted. Another howl joins the first, then a third, then silence again. The pack is awake. You glance at the fire, then feed it a thin stick of pine, just enough to tease a little more glow. You don't want to draw attention, just enough light to keep the shapes in the dark from creeping too close. Without invitation, your rifle lies nearby, propped against a rock, but you don't reach for it. Not yet. It's not that kind of night. You lean back against the thick trunk of a spruce, feeling the bark through the blanket at your back. It presses into you rough, grounding, like being reminded you're real. In the distance, an owl hoots once, then again. But it's not talking to you. Nothing here ever really island. They speak to each other, and you just happen to overhear. The wolves continue, not in unison, but in scattered, separate voices, some deep, some thin, some like whined through a bone flute. Their chorus rolls across the land, unbothered by the idea of borders or property or fear. They speak to each other across miles, reaffirming their presence, their position, their persistence. You take a slow breath. The air is cool, not icy, but enough to make each inhale feel fresh, like it's rinsing the inside of your chest. This is the wild, not just in geography, but in rhythm. You are not merely surrounded by trees. You are inside something living, breathing, watching. And tonight, it's the wolves who are watching you. You remember stories told by firelight, some true, some embroidered, some only half remembered. Stories of men chased across rivers, of camps raided in the night, of trails gone quiet and never waking. But those stories always had sharp teeth, and you've lived long enough to know that the truth is usually quieter than that. Wolves are curious, careful, more afraid of you than you are willing to admit. Still, they're out there. You imagine them just beyond the reach of firelight, eyes low to the ground, bodies slipping between tree trunks like smoke and fur, paws making no sound, noses raised to the air to catch a whiff of meat, of ash, of man. You know what you smell like to them. You smell like sweat and leather and gunpowder. You smell like something unfamiliar and a little dangerous. That's enough, most of the time, to keep them back. But not always. You shift slightly in your seat, stretching your legs out, toes wiggling inside your moccasins. The movement makes a faint creak. A twig snaps underfoot. Somewhere, a rustle answers. Then stillness again. The pack goes quiet. And that's the part you pay attention to. Because the silence of wolves is louder than their howling. You reach for the rifle, but don't raise it. You just lay it across your lap, the metal cold even through the blanket. Minutes pass, or maybe hours. Time loses its edges out here, slipping into something rounder, slower, like water wearing down a stone. Eventually, you hear movement again, this time farther away. The wolves are walking, maybe patrolling their boundary, maybe searching for a stream, maybe just moving for the sake of moving. They're not coming for you tonight. Not yet. Not this time. The tension in your chest eases, though it never really leaves. It's just part of the fabric of nights like this. Not fear, but respect. A quiet understanding that you are not at the top here. You are not the center. You are just another shape in the dark, just another voice, trying to be heard without being noticed. You add one more stick to the fire. It catches slowly, like a secret. The flames curl upward, casting faint shadows against the low limbs of nearby trees. And you whisper just once into the night. Go on now. Whether it's to the wolves or to the wind, you're not sure. But something hears, because the forest begins to breathe again, The birds shift, the wind returns, and the wolves, for now, are gone. The morning is quiet, not just still, but reverent. The kind of quiet that feels like the land itself is holding its breath. Mist hangs low between the trees, hovering just above the undergrowth like a memory that refuses to leave. The sky is gray-blue, and the sun, though rising, hasn't made its presence known yet. You rise slowly, stretching muscles that slept beneath a sky full of stars. Last night's fire is now only ash, scattered lightly like flour across blackened stone. You stir it gently with a stick, not to reignite it, but to feel some trace of its warmth. There is none. Your hands ache a little today, stiff from the damp air, the kind that seeps into bones and lingers. But there's no complaint, just movement. You're used to waking sore. The forest here feels different this morning, less like a wilderness and more like something waiting. The birds are slow to sing. Even the chipmunks, normally frantic and bold, stay tucked in their hollows. You sense it in your chest. A heaviness, a hush. Today will not be ordinary. You sling your powder horn over your shoulder, the wood stopper worn smooth by hundreds of fingers. Your rifle rests against a cedar log, already cleaned and checked the night before. You run your hand along its stock. Walnut carved by hand, darkened by time and sweat and history. It's not just a tool, not just a weapon. It's a companion, reliable, familiar, unforgiving. You load it slowly, pouring the black powder with care, as if the forest might hear it falling. Wadding ball tamped tight with the rod. You do it by feel, barely looking down. Your eyes are on the trees. Because somewhere out there, something else is loaded too. And not all the powder in this wilderness comes from your hands. There are others nearby. Men, likely. You haven't seen them yet, but you've felt their presence for days. Traces in the soil, broken branches that broke wrong, ashes still warm in camps you didn't build. You don't know if they're trappers, or traitors, or trouble. But you do know this. They're armed. That changes everything. The wild doesn't mind your musket, but people do. People notice who has it drawn first. People remember who fired first. And sometimes, people forget to fire last. You walk carefully now, not just through the brush, but through the possibility of violence. Every step is measured. Each twig snapped underfoot is a decision you didn't mean to make. The forest thickens as you go, pines and maples crowding closer together, their limbs casting long shadows that fall like bars across the pathless ground. Then you hear it. Not loud, not clear, but real. A branch breaking, boots shifting against dry leaves. Voices, low, muffled. English? French? Lenape? You can't tell, but you know the rhythm. Men moving with caution. You crouch low behind a fallen log, your rifle angled quietly across your knees. You steady your breath, inhale through your nose, hold, exhale through your teeth, and wait. The voices grow clearer. 3, maybe 4 men, not talking exactly, more like murmuring, The way men speak when they don't want to be heard, but want to be obeyed. Then it happens. The crack of a flintlock, not yours. Theirs. The sound rips through the trees like thunder, ripped from a velvet sky. A shot not aimed at you, but close enough to wake your nerves. You don't rise. You don't return fire. Not yet. A crow startles from a branch above and calls like it's laughing at all of you. Another shot, closer this time. Then silence. Not a dead silence. A listening one. Everyone, it seems, is waiting for the next move. And then you see him, a shape between trees. Tall, wearing a tattered coat, rifle slung low, eyes scanning the woods like they know they're being watched. You don't raise your own gun. You just stay still. Because in this forest, being seen is often the first mistake. The man moves past. Not toward you. Not away. Just through. His footsteps fade, and with them, the pressure in your chest slowly recedes. You wait 5 more minutes, maybe 10. Then you rise slow, steady, rifle still cold in your hands. No bullet spent, no blood spilled. Not today. And still, the primeval silence never really returns. Not the way it was before. Gunpowder changes things. Not just landscapes, but relationship. Even out here, where no borders are drawn and no courts exist, the powder keeps score. You walk back to your camp before night falls. The air feels thinner now. Not colder, just less forgiving. Like the forest has watched you make a choice. Even if you never pulled the trigger. You sit beside the fire again that night. Quiet. Hands blackened from smoke. Clothes smelling of wood and sweat and something heavier. You wonder about the man in the woods. Who he was. What he saw. Whether he fired the first shot or just the next one. And you wonder how many more days like this the wild can hold before the powder burns it all away. For now, the night is calm, but it listens. It always listens. And the silence that follows a firefight is the loudest sound the forest knows. There are no hospitals here. No sterile walls or white linen beds. No steady hands of trained surgeons. Or cabinets full of pills with names no one can pronounce. Here in the wild American primeval, medicine begins with memory, and healing begins with stillness. You wake slowly today, not from sound, but from the dull ache beneath your ribs. Not pain exactly, just a heaviness. A bruise, perhaps, earned from slipping on wet stone yesterday. As you cross the creek, you touch the spot gently, your fingers cold from morning air, and you wince not from agony, but from the realization that you'll carry this discomfort a while. There will be no pills to dull it, no ointment squeezed from a tube, only time and the forest. You rise slowly, pressing your palm against the tree trunk beside your lean-to. The bark is cool and damp from overnight fog, and it leaves a dusting of moss against your skin. You stretch your arms, working out the stiffness. Each joint clicks like an old latch unlocking. Today, you won't travel far. The body says no. So instead, you turn to tending. There's a satchel hanging from a low branch. Stitched hide, stained with years of use, and within it, the tools of healing as they exist out here. Bundles of dried roots, twists of bark, moss pressed into linen, a bit of bear grease in a clay pot. sealed with wax. You crouch by the fire pit and begin the morning task. Boiling water drawn from the creek, cleared of grit with a cloth filter, and set in the kettle you've carried for years. It has a dent near the bottom, a story in itself. A reminder that even metal can bend when dropped from a ridge in a moment of surprise. You gather herbs with a familiar rhythm. A pinch of yarrow dried and crumbling, its bitter scent waking your nose. A few sprigs of pine needles for taste and breath. Some crushed willow bark, which quiets pain if left to steep. It doesn't numb like the medicines in cities, but it takes the edge off. And sometimes that's enough. Your fingers move with quiet intention, dropping each piece into the boiling water. You watch as the steam rises, carrying the wild sense of healing into the morning air. Beside the fire, a strip of cloth is laid out, not white, not clean by modern standards, but sun-bleached and washed in river stones. You soak it in the brew and press it against your ribs, wrapping it gently and tying it snug. The warmth seeps in slowly, and for a moment, you breathe easier. You remember the first time you tried to treat yourself, a gash across your palm from a careless slip with a skinning knife. You didn't panic. You didn't cry. You just stared at the blood and wondered what came next. A traveling trapper, long gone now, had shown you what to do. Press moss into the wound, wrap it with hide, and hold it tight. He said, if it itches, you're healing. If it burns, you're infected. If it smells sweet, get ready to meet your maker. It was said as a joke, sort of, but you remembered. You always remember, because forgetting means pain. And out here, pain ignored becomes danger. The forest, for all its beauty, does not forgive. Still, it gives. If you listen, you gather spruce sap from a nearby tree, cutting a line into the bark and watching it weep slowly. The resin is thick, golden, and sticky. Used to seal cuts, to keep moisture out. You place it in a tin beside the fire and let it melt down to a thick balm. It smells sharp, almost clean. You test it with a fingertip and then apply it to an old scrape on your forearm, a relic of last week's brush with thorn bush or bear claw. You're still not sure. There's also a pouch of dried plantain leaves, not the fruit, but the weed that grows low and wide, usually by your boot. It draws poison out when chewed and pressed to a bite. You chew one now, slowly, more for ritual than need. Its taste is earthy, bitter, but strangely calming. You let it sit in your cheek as you rest by the fire, watching the morning stretch into itself. You recall how the elders from a distant tribe, whose name you never could pronounce, right, taught you that medicine is not just the act, but the intention. The healing is in the stillness, in the quiet care, in knowing that the body, given a chance, remembers how to mend. They showed you how to grind echinacea root with a river stone, how to make salves from bear fat and spruce ash, how to wait, truly wait, for the earth to answer. They never rushed. Even if someone was bleeding, they moved with reverence. And in that stillness, they often saved lives. You keep those lessons close. The sky brightens, but the sun remains hidden behind low cloud. No rush of heat, no glare. Just a dim, steady light that feels like early afternoon, even though the day has only just begun. You set aside your herbs, retying each bundle with care, placing them back in the pouch in the same order you always do, not out of habit, but out of respect. These plants, these barks, they are your allies, your tools, and sometimes your final hope. Later, you will gather more. You've noticed the boneset plant near the stream, its pale clusters swaying like quiet flags. Its leaves help fevers break. You'll take only what you need, never more. Because out here, greed is remembered, and so is gratitude. You sip the cooled tea. It tastes like tree bark and rainwater with a touch of bitter root. It's not pleasant, but it's grounding, and it helps. And sometimes that's all you can ask. You lean back on your blanket, close your eyes for a few minutes, and breathe deep, letting the forest hum its low, steady lullaby through the trees, across the moss, and into your chest. Your pain is still there. Your bruise hasn't vanished, but there's warmth now. There's quiet, and there's a sense, however faint, that healing has begun. Not because of pills, not because of clinics, but because you listened, because you waited, because you remembered, and because in the wild American primeval, the forest still knows how to care for those who move slowly enough to be seen. The day doesn't begin with a sunrise. Not really. The sky is a dull, smudged gray from the start, thick with clouds that look less like sky and more like old wool soaking in cold water. Even the birds seem hesitant. No song. Just the faint rustle of feathers in the branches above. You wake to the weight of humidity on your chest. There's no breeze. No clean breath of morning. Only the stillness that comes before something large and loud decides to arrive. Storms are never quiet out here. They don't sneak in. They roll and boil and speak in deep voices that shake the trees from root to crown. And today, you can feel one coming. Your camp is modest. A lean-to of bark and bent limbs, patched with hide where the rain always finds its way in. It's not meant for weather like this. You know that already. But there's no cabin to run to. No inn with warm blankets and dry bread. Only the forest. And whatever you can make of it, you check your supplies with steady hands. A satchel of dried food, kept tight in waxed linen. A tin cup. Your powder horn carefully corked. Your flint and steel. And the rifle, wiped dry each night, and wrapped now in an oilskin roll. As the first drops begin to fall. At first, they're gentle, polite almost. Tiny taps on the leaves, a soft knocking from above. But polite doesn't last long out here. And you know what's coming next. The wind arrives like a breath held too long. A long exhale across the land. It bends the trees at the crown, and they answer with groans. Not frightened, just old, tired of being pushed around by a sky that doesn't ask permission. You pull the hide tighter around your shoulders and start moving, not running, just walking with purpose. There's a hollow you've seen before, not far, just beyond the ridge. A cluster of boulders that leans into the hillside where roots drape down like curtains, and the ground dips just enough to call it shelter. You head there now, each step sinking a little deeper into the forest floor as the rain thickens. What was once a path is now soft mud, and what were once leaves are now slick blades, waiting to pull you down. Thunder speaks, low and long, not sharp yet, just announcing itself like a drumbeat far away. A reminder, you are not the center here. You are not in control. You are a guest, and the host is awakening. The first real downpour begins halfway to the hollow. It comes suddenly, like a sheet of coal being unrolled from the clouds. The sound is immediate, not a patter, but a constant roar, like a river falling out of the sky. You pull the hide up over your head and lower your body as you walk, trying not to slip on roots that have become ropes of ice beneath your feet. Your boots are soaked. There's no preventing that. The water seeps in at the seams and settles around your toes, cold and heavy. You step through puddles that weren't there an hour ago. Your knees splashed with mud, the color of iron. Still, you keep walking, because standing still in weather like this isn't a choice. The cold will find you, and it doesn't bargain. You reach the hollow just as the second thunderclap crashes. This one closer, louder. It echoes through your chest like a slow hammer. But you're already pulling yourself beneath the curtain of roots, sliding down the wet slope to the cluster of boulders that open like a broken mouth in the hillside. It's not dry. Nothing is now, but it's drier. And that's enough. You wedge your satchel between two stones and sit back, knees drawn up, watching the storm pour across the forest. The trees sway like dancers in a slow, chaotic rhythm. Their branches whip and twist, leaves tearing loose and spiraling down like torn paper. Rainwater runs in thin rivers down the trunks, pooling in hollows, cutting new paths through the soil. Everything is moving, even the earth. You take off your boots, dump them out, and wring your socks. Not to get dry. That's not happening. Just to remember what dry once felt like. You rest your head against the stone and close your eyes for a moment. The storm is louder now, but it no longer startles. It's just a voice now, speaking in thunder and rain, and the rustle of things too small to see, fleeing for their own shelter. You think of others who've weathered storms like this. Trappers, hunters, scouts, moving through lands with no names, soaked to the bone, huddled in caves, wrapping themselves in deer hide, and hoping the fire stays lit. They did not curse the weather. They didn't plead for clear skies. They endured. As you do now, you reach into your pack and pull out a bit of jerky, dry, hard, but welcome. You chew it slowly, its salt and smoke grounding you. You think of warmth, not longing for it, but remembering it. The way dry clothes feel, the crackle of fire, the hiss of water in a hot pan, those memories are enough to keep the cold at bay. For a while, outside the hollow, a branch cracks and falls, striking the ground with a dull thud. You don't flinch. There's no room for panic here, only patience. You watch the rain for hours, maybe more. There's no clock, just the gradual shift of light and the slow rhythm of the storm easing. It doesn't stop, not yet, but it softens. The roar becomes a whisper. The thunder moves on. The wind turns gentle, and the silence that follows is deep and soft, like moss beneath bare feet. You crawl from your hollow, into a forest rinsed clean. The leaves shimmer, the ground glistens. The air is sweet with the scent of rain and pine and something ancient. You stand, stretch, and let the last drops fall from your brow. You are soaked, but alive, cold, but whole. And in this world, the wild American primeval, that is enough. That is everything, because storms do not last. But those who walk through them carry their memory forever. The rain has passed, but the air is thicker than before. As if the storm didn't leave, it simply sank down, settling across the earth like a damp woolen coat. Everything is wet. Your pack, your boots, your sleeves. Even the bark on the trees holds droplets like glass beads, glistening in the sun that now peeks through heavy clouds. You sit beneath a tree, not because you're tired, but because the forest asks for stillness after a storm. It's part of the rhythm. Rush and then wait. But waiting doesn't mean peace. Not today, because with the heat and the damp comes the buzz. That slow, building whine, high and circling. You hear it before you feel it. The insects have arrived. The first sting is polite, a question mark on the back of your neck. Was that a leaf? Number. You reach back too late and feel the welt rising already. The second bite comes with more confidence, and then a third, and a fourth, until the buzzing is constant, not sound anymore, but presence. You swat lazily. You scratch. You pull your hat lower, tuck your sleeves tighter, but they find the edges. They always do. This is not the biting cold of winter, nor the hunger of predators. This is the slow, persistent attack of creatures so small you almost feel silly fighting back. Almost. Because out here, in the wild American primeval, bugs are more than nuisance. They're reality. They define entire seasons. You learn to measure time by how thick the swarms get, how high the welts rise. A mosquito lands on your knuckle. Elegant, really. Its legs delicate. Its body no heavier than ash. You watch it, just for a second. Its thin body swelling with your blood. Before you slap it flat, it leaves behind a red smear and an itch that will last hours. You reach into your pouch and pull out what little you've prepared. A bundle of dried sweetgrass, crushed pine needles, crumbled birch bark, all tossed into a shallow metal bowl and lit with flint and steel, smoke. That's the only real defense. Not fire, but the scent of it curling through the air like a slow warning. The bugs hate it. Or at least, they seem to. They drift back. Not gone, never gone, but slower now. Less bold. You wave the smoke around your arms, your face, your neck. It works. A little. You can breathe again without inhaling wings, and still the itch lingers. Behind your ears, at the back of your knees, inside your collar, you scratch not to fix it, but because it's a way to pass the time. The sun climbs higher. It's only noon, and yet the day feels already full, heavy, thick with the smell of sweat and earth and plant life that has been stepped on, burned, or bled. You drink from your canteen, lukewarm water, but welcome. Each gulp tastes faintly of metal and bark. You pour a little over your wrists just to feel clean. The water runs in thin lines down your arms, picking up dust and dried blood and falling to the forest floor without a sound. Above you, a dragonfly dances in loops, long and blue and fast, chasing smaller bugs, nature's sword in flight. You watch it for a long time, jealous of its freedom, its speed, its indifference, and still the buzz continues. You shift in place, feeling the dampness in your clothes grow hotter. Nothing breathes when it's soaked. Everything clings. Your shirt, your pants, even your hair. It's as though the forest is trying to wrap itself around you, like a second skin you never asked for. In the brush, ants scurry in chaotic highways, each one with purpose, none of it explained. They move over your blanket without care. You flick them away, but more arrive. They always do. You remember stories from old trappers, how they would smear bare fat on trees to distract swarms of bugs, leaving themselves untouched, or cover their skin in clay until they looked like living statues, bitten less because the bugs couldn't smell them. You've tried both. They work. But you'd rather not sit caked in mud all day. Not yet, anyway. A gnat lands on your lip. You twitch. Another on your eyelid. You blink. They are relentless. Insignificant alone, but overwhelming together, like hunger, like cold, like loneliness. Out here, insects are the background noise of summer. They sing from the grass, from the bark, from the air itself. You stop noticing them only when you give up. And that's the trick, really. To stop fighting, to let them buzz, to let them bite, to become part of the itch and whine, until it fades into something you can sleep through. You lie back on your bedroll, pull your hat over your eyes, and breathe slowly. The smoke from your bowl curls upward, and the bugs keep their distance just barely. And for a moment, just one. You feel calm, not because it's peaceful, but because you've accepted the lack of peace. This is survival, not heroism, just discomfort tolerated for one more hour, one more day. Noon passes. The sun climbs higher. The itch remains. And still, you rest. Because out here, when the fight can't be won, you wait. You listen. You breathe. And you let the forest do what it has always done, crawl across your skin until it becomes your own. The sun does not fall here. It withdraws. Slowly, quietly, like an old friend slipping out the back door, so as not to disturb the gathering. The afternoon lingers longer than you expect, casting a soft gold through the tallest branches where the light filters down like it's been strained through honey. You sit beneath a pine, legs stretched out, back resting against bark that's both rough and familiar. There's no rush, no bell to toll the end of the day, only the gradual hush of the forest as it prepares for night. The birds begin to soften their voices. The busy chirps of morning have faded into slow, thoughtful whistles. Some call once, then twice, then fall quiet for good. You sip water from your tin cup, warmed by the air and tasting faintly of the moss it brushed against. You're used to that now. Nothing out here tastes clean, in the way the city might define it. But everything is pure, in its own way. You glance toward the west, where the light is thickest, a molten edge along the horizon, as if the world were dipped in fire, but never burned. The trees seem to lean toward it, pulling in the last warmth of the day, before surrendering to the cool breath of dusk. You stretch, muscles stiff, clothes damp in places you wish they weren't. But there's comfort in the discomfort. You're alive, awake, present. The bugs are fewer now. The day's heat has faded, and with it, their urgency. They hover at the edge of your awareness, but they no longer command it. The forest, once loud with the rustling of small lives, has become still. Not empty, just expectant, as if all things are waiting together for the same moment, that final slipping of the sun behind the hills. You stand, not quickly, just enough to change your view. Your boots press softly into the leaf litter, a bed of pine needles and fallen birch bark that muffles your steps, like fresh snow. The sky above you is changing fast, from amber to rose, to violet to ink, a gradient of sleep, stretched wide across the heavens. You've seen this transition 100 times, and each time, it feels like watching a page turn. In a book the forest has been writing forever. You gather firewood without urgency. Broken limbs, twisted roots, pieces of pine so dry they crack in your grip. You build your fire the way you always do, carefully, with patience. Not for warmth just yet, but for company. The first spark catches after a few strikes, kissing the kindling with a soft hiss. It grows slowly, not a roar, not a blaze, just a quiet pulse of flame, rising into a sky now deep with twilight. You settle beside it, cross-legged, shoulders loose. The fire reflects in your eyes, and for a time, there is nothing else. No thought, no noise, just the flicker, and the slow measured beat of your own breath. A breeze stirs, cool but not cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, with just a trace of smoke from your fire. You breathe it in, as though it might remember you, as though you could become part of it. And in this hour, this perfect flickering hour, maybe you already are. A fox appears at the edge of the clearing, not close, just visible enough. Red fur brushed by shadow, eyes catching the firelight. For a single glinting second, it does not move closer. It does not run. It's simply island, and then it isn't. That's how twilight works here. It gives, then it takes. And all you can do is sit still and say thank you. Above you, the first stars arrive. Not in clusters, not in crowds. Just one, then another, like notes played on an invisible string. They twinkle, yes, but more than that, they remind you that the world has always been much, much bigger. Then, whatever troubles, you carry it into the forest. You add a log to the fire. It pops, sending sparks upward. In a brief imitation of the stars above, they rise and vanish. And still, the fire remains. You cook a small supper, just jerky warmed near the flame, softened with water. You chew slowly, as if to stretch the moment, as long as it will go. You eat alone, but never lonely, because the forest is here, the trees, the sky, the wind. They do not speak, but they keep you company. Night comes fully now, wrapping itself around your shoulders like a blanket pulled up by hands you cannot see. The fire is your only light. Its glow reaches out into the dark, but only so far. The rest must be trusted. That's the agreement. You lie back on your blanket, boots still on, hat tilted over your eyes. The fire crackles beside you, and the night sings its slow, soft lullaby. Crickets in the brush, the hoot of an owl, the rustling of some animal just passing through. And slowly, the world closes its eyes. Because in the wild American primeval, sunset is not the end of the day. It's the beginning of the hush, the welcome silence that makes room for sleep, for stillness, for the stories the darkness tells, only to those who are willing to listen. Night has a different voice out here. It doesn't whisper. It doesn't speak loudly either. It listens first, waits, then answers, in sounds you don't recognize, and in feelings you don't quite understand. You lie with your eyes closed, not yet asleep. The fire beside you has settled, its flames now low and lazy, licking gently at the blackened wood. Every so often, a log pops, breaking the hush, like a knuckle cracking in a cathedral. Above you, the stars hold steady, pinned in place by the cold breath of the high air. You open your eyes just enough to catch the Milky Way stretching, like spilled salt across the sky. The ground beneath you is hard but familiar. The blanket beneath your shoulders is still a little damp from the storm, but you've long since stopped noticing. What matters now is the warmth of the fire, the rhythm of your breathing, and the night. And then, a sound. Not wind. Not fire. Not you. A step. Soft. Measured. On leaves just beyond the reach of firelight. You do not move. You do not speak. Out here, to move too soon is to speak out of turn. The forest is telling you something, and it's rude to interrupt. Another step, a rustle, then silence. You sit up slowly, hat in your lap, one hand resting on the cool wood of your rifle, not drawn, just close. A habit, not a threat. The night remains thick, still, but not quiet. There's a pattern to the silence now, like something just beyond your vision is circling, not hunting, just observing. You've felt this before. The sensation of eyes, not hostile, but old, curious, perhaps even kind. You speak, finally, not loudly, just enough. I hear you. The words drift into the dark and return with no reply. But the rustling stops, and so does your heart, just for a moment. Then, a single exhale, a deer perhaps, or a fox. or something else. You'll never know. And out here, you don't have to. You lie back down. The fire sighs beside you. Its warmth reaches your side, like an old dog leaning in close. And in the spaces between the cracks of the burning wood, you hear them again. Those footsteps, further off now, moving on, leaving you be, but their echo lingers, not in sound, but in memory, in the way your neck hair stood, in the way your chest forgot to rise for a beat, in the way you now listen to every creak of the forest as though it might mean something. You turn over, facing away from the fire now, letting the darkness stretch behind your eyes and seep into your chest like a slow, steady tide. There's no fear here, only awareness. And in the wild American primeval, awareness is everything. The unseen things of the forest, they are not always dangers. Sometimes they are reminders that you are not alone, that you are being watched, not by enemies, but by the place itself, by the branches that creak even without wind, by the moss that glows faintly in moonlight, by the soil that remembers every foot that has ever stepped upon it. The night deepens. Somewhere far off, an owl calls once, and then again, a long, low note that rolls across the trees and vanishes into the folds of the sky. You feel the weight of your eyelids now, the itch of weariness in your shoulders. The fire has dimmed to coals, its light no longer cast, but breathed. A heartbeat in red and orange at the center of the dark. And still, you hear the steps, not in sound, but in imagination, in memory. In the part of you that knows this forest never sleeps, even when you do, you wrap your blanket tighter around you, you curl in toward the fire, and as your breathing slows, as your thoughts fade into shapes and echoes, you let the last memory of those footsteps carry you not into fear, but into rest. Because in the wild American primeval, some things walk the forest, not to threaten, but to remind, to keep watch, to pass by, so you don't feel too alone. The fire is low now, just coals. Their glow pulses faintly, breathing in the hush of the forest, like a slow heart in the chest of the world. You're half asleep, but not quite. That gentle drift, when your limbs are heavy, your thoughts loose and long, like threads floating downstream. You stare at the glowing embers, not really looking, just letting their shape blur and flicker, like memories from someone else's life. They move like old stories, slow, worn, but familiar. And that's when you begin to remember them. The tales, not written down, not told around dinner tables. These are the stories shared out here, in forests, on long walks, beside fading fires, when voices are soft and eyes glance toward the shadows, just beyond the flame. You've heard them from trappers, loners, wanderers, men and women with skin like tanned bark, and voices as rough as river stones. Some stories were lies, most of them actually, but good lies. Kind lies. The kind that make you feel warm, not deceived. You remember one man, his name already fading, who swore he met a creature deep in the woods, shaped like a man but with glowing eyes, never seen fully, always just beyond a tree. He said it watched him for 3 nights straight. Didn't move, didn't blink. And then, on the fourth night, it left an arrowhead beside his bedroll. Black stone, too sharp, too perfect. He still had it when you met him. Swore it hummed when the moon was full. You didn't believe him. Of course you didn't. But the way he told it, slow, quiet, with one hand on his knee and the other by the fire, you almost wanted it to be true. Because what else are nights for, if not for wondering what might be watching? There was a woman, too, older than most, with gray hair in a braid and eyes like cloudy glass. She didn't tell stories so much as whisper them between mouthfuls of broth. Said there was a tree somewhere in the valley that had bones in its root, old ones, from before even her great-grandfather's time. She claimed it sang in winter, only when snow covered its trunk. Said the bark peeled back like skin, and if you listened close, you could hear it telling the names of every creature buried beneath it. No one ever found that tree, but no one ever really looked. You shift slightly on your blanket, tugging it tighter around your shoulders. A chill has crept into the air, not sharp, but present. The kind of chill that invites stories. You speak aloud, just to the fire, just to the dark. Remember the man who married a ghost? Your voice is hoarse, almost unfamiliar. But the story comes back, like a forgotten friend. He lived near the mountain ridge, or so they said, alone, kept to himself. One night, a woman came to his fire, young, pale, dressed in linen too fine for the trail. She never spoke, just sat beside him and stayed, day after day, never aged, never ate. But he loved her all the same. Built her a cabin, left offerings, called her his wife. And one spring morning, he was gone. No sign of struggle, no blood. Just a single white ribbon tied around the tallest tree, near where his fire used to be. You smile at the absurdity, but part of you doesn't laugh. Not entirely. Because out here, in the wild American primeval, the line between real and imagined is thinner than people think. And sometimes, belief is a more useful thing than fact. You add one last stick to the fire. It hisses, then catches. Just enough to remind the night that you're still here, still listening. There are other tales, too, of lanterns that float across swamps, with no hand to carry them, of black wolves that leave no prints in snow, of a cave that swallows sound so deep and twisted that even a scream becomes a whisper, and a whisper disappears entirely. You've never seen those places, but you've seen the men who claim to have, and you've looked into their eyes and seen the kind of fear that doesn't come from lying. Maybe they believe their stories. Maybe belief is what keeps them sane. When the world becomes too quiet, too vast, you shift again. The fire is low, but steady. The stars wheel slowly overhead. The night continues, unchanged, unbothered. You hum, softly, a tune you don't remember learning. One you've always known. Maybe it came from one of those stories. Maybe it came from the wind. The forest listens, not eagerly, not impatiently, but with the slow attention of something that has time to spare. And as the fire settles once more into soft red hums of heat, you close your eyes, not to escape the stories, but to join them, because every night out here writes a new one. And maybe someday someone will whisper your story too, beside a fire, beneath the stars, to no one in particular. And maybe you'll be listening.